Hi, I'm Dr. Hackie Reitman. Welcome to another episode of Exploring Different Brains. And today we are so fortunate to have with us the assistant professor from Nova Southeastern University in family and marriage counseling and so much more, Dr. Pei-Fen Li. Pei-Fen, welcome.
Thank you so much for your invitation. It's my honor to be here.
Well, why don't you introduce yourself properly because I probably messed it up. And I know you do a lot of other things too.
My name is Pei-Fen, and I am originally from Taiwan. Uh, Pretty much grew up and received my college education in Taiwan. Then I decided to come to United States to pursue my master and doctoral degree in marriage and family therapy. So right now I'm working as a full-time faculty at Nova Southeastern University Department of Family Therapy program. Yes, so I have been moved around in United States because when I did my master, I was in Oregon. Then I went back to Taiwan to practice for another 3 years. Then came back to Georgia to do my doctoral degree for 6 years. Then I moved to Connecticut for another 1 year, also teaching there before I moved down to Florida. So I kind of move around in United States and experience different kind of culture, working with different people. Yeah.
You don't look old enough to have done all those
Oh
things.
well, I am old enough, yeah. But okay. I really appreciate my agent gene. I don't look as my real like a bio, biological age, I guess. Yeah.
Now, do you have a favorite subspecialty of all the things you do?
Okay, I think there are several. Currently, I'm working for a grant project. Actually, I did a grant project in 2017. So we provide solution focused oriented group therapy for those parents. They have a children of autism, and I have learned a lot from that process because it's an international project. We collaborated with two Taiwanese scholars there. It's not a perfect project, but we have learned a lot how to do collaboration internationally, how to engage, the parents there to attend the group therapy. I just kind of modify the project design a little bit, and then we receive another grant. We're gonna replicate the same study with the parents in Western in the local community clinic in the coming fall. Yeah, so that's one special area that I'm currently doing right now. The other one is I'm also interested in exploring like the influence of acculturation on immigrants. Currently, I'm working with one of my students who is from Cuba originally, and he wants to do his dissertation study about how Cuban family, since they come to United States, what's their acculturation process look like, what type of cultural strategy the whole family adopt to adjust to the United States here. So that's another track of research that I'm currently working with my student. Also, I have a third track. Usually, I'm just curious, how, because as an international scholar, I am always curious how MFT theory that I have learned in United States have been applied in a different culture. So another course that I have teaching in my program is we call International Perspective of Family and Counseling. And every other 2 years, we also have that collaboration between our program and Beijing Normal University. We will visit some city in China and engage I and my student, we will went to China and visit their program and participate their international forum of MFT conference every other years and engage some culture trip there.
Now, acculturation, you're defining that as an immigrant comes over, say, to the United States, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and take us through the acculturation process.
Acculturation happen when two group of people they meet and how they are learning from each others in terms of the other side's cultural value, their cultural attitude, even their cultural behavior. So for example, for those international students, or for those immigrants, or for those sojourners, or for those business people, they often travel around the world. So when they'll carry on their own heritage cultural value, like, I'm carrying on my Taiwanese Chinese culture value, my behavior, and when I come to United States, how I engage myself into the dominant discourse here. So for example, when I came in here, I noticed, you stand up and then you approach me, you hug me. But in Taiwanese culture, we don't usually do that when we greet each other. We would stand up, we would shake, we would hand our hand in the front and then shake each other's. So it's a different way of greeting. So for me as a foreigner, how I modify my behavior, my value, my perception of your way of greeting and adjust in that situation. So I think acculturation is kind of take both sides, both group of people, their effort to get to know each other and to find a middle way to meet each other.
What do you think is the biggest um, lack of understanding or the biggest misconception that a layperson like me might have about acculturation and immigration from your psychological perspective?
If I go back to early on the definition I give about acculturation, I think acculturation take both sides effort. But the interesting thing is, I think most of the time, people or the dominant discourse here in one country, they usually expect the immigrant or those sojourner to adjust more rather than themselves. So I feel like that's maybe where is the conflict, or maybe there's where's the disagreement, or maybe that's where the misunderstanding arise. If I'm just imagine if the dominant discourse here or the dominant culture here in the United States, they are willing to take a more learning stance, try to understand what is really going on with those people, why they choose to come to United States, why they don't choose to go to another countries, and learn and engage their dialogue with them. I guess they might open the more opportunity for each side to get to know each other's more rather than shutting doors too quickly, before to engage them.
Now, one of the groups that you're engaging with are the parents of children with autism.
Yes.
What patterns might you be able to comment on at this point in your knowledge?
Based on my interaction with those Taiwanese parents, I think like lots of research has demonstrated, when you notice how the parents, how the spouse, they manage, their role in relation to the raising their kids. You see, usually the mother is still the main caretaker role. They give transportation to take the kids to here and there to receive the training, to get the service that needs the kids needs, and the father is the main breadwinner. So when you notice that, sometimes I feel like how we can better kind of challenge that pattern a little bit. So in a way, the mother won't feel that much burden throughout that parenting process.
And then it's complicated by the fact that there's, I believe, a higher rate of divorce, at least in America, among the special needs parents. And in my book, I call the single mothers the pit bulls with an angel's mentality, because, as you said, they have to fight with the doctor and the system and the insurance and the teachers. And they also have to bring home the bread in many instances, too.
Yeah, you are right.
It's kind of tough.
Right.
What are the biggest differences you see between the Taiwanese population in this regard versus what you see here in America?
Well, I think the research has demonstrated some similarity and some differences. The similarity including, of course, raising a kids with the special need. Usually, they will increase their marital distress and lower their marital quality. And sometimes both parents they also feel like they also experience some like psychological well-being issue, like experience anxiety or depression. There are some research that specifically is done in China or in Taiwan. They notice the mother would even worry more about their kids' future. I think that tie back to, especially for the couple, if they play more rigid, like a gender role. So lots of time, because the mother is usually the one who provide the main caretaker, who notice that what kind of challenge or anticipate what kind of challenge that her kids might gonna experience in the future. So it promote more like a worry and anxiety for the mother rather than the father. I think there's one study also talk about in China in some city. They noticed that the kids they experience more discrimination from the majority of people when they don't have enough knowledge about what really happened to their special case.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah. But for the similarity, I feel like this is just my clinical observational perspective. I think for the most part, I feel like those family, like other normal family, in my perspective, because I see most parents, they are very willing to sacrifice themselves to find every resources they can find to support their kids, to make their kids thrive, in the future.
What got you interested in therapy?
Wow, that's you just remind me. You just throw me back to my memory. Back to back to my day of being interviewed in my doctoral program. Like why you choose family therapy? Because when I was a guidance teacher working in Taiwan, when I'm working with those adolescents, usually you notice when you work with those kids, you cannot not talk with their parents because lots of their behavior issue or psychological issue they mention about is always related to their family member, either tie back to how the parents treat them, how they perceive parents treat them, or what's their relationship with other sibling. So lots of time I need to, with the kids, I would talk with the kids, hey, would that be okay if I invite your parents come to the school and that's a conversation about? Or would that be okay if I call your parents, try to really understand what's really going on in your family? Because when you hear kids' story, that's one side of the story, but you
Sure.
really want to hear another side of the story too. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of the therapist's self?
Mm. The role of the therapist self in regards to
And your protocols and how you go about things.
how I mean how I do therapy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, pretty much I follow the, what's the ethic, what's the ethical protocol look like, I think the most important thing for me is how you build the therapeutic relationship with your client. So the first few sessions, I will really try to get to know my client, where they are coming from, what's their expectation about working with me. I will also be very clear about the contract, what's my expectation throughout the therapeutic process. And I encourage them to ask me any question, so through that process, through that inquiring process, that they also have a chance to get to know me. Yeah, so I think for the first few sessions, they are building a good relationship, how we can work with each other, how, they feel like I'm a trustworthy person, they can rely on to throughout the changing process. Yeah.
Um, what have you seen in your students? What do you think of today's students, your students?
In general?
In terms of students nowadays changing, and in what ways might you think they are changing?
Well, I think I really need to clarify a little bit because I think Nova Southeastern University is a very special learning context because we have a lot of untraditional students. We have a lot of students, they already work in the field, and some of them are licensed therapists already. And then they come back, they decide to pursue their degree. And of course, we have some, they are straightforward students, they just graduated from college, still very young, learn how to do therapy professionally, ethically, also maturely, in my perspective. So we do have a diversity among our students. So I don't want to say in a very stereotypical way,
Sure.
to categorize one way than the other. But I do think teaching nowadays with the current generation is, in my perspective, I feel like it's much more challenged compared to when I was a student at UGA. UGA is more like a research institute. And I don't know, I feel like there is a more like a hierarchy set up between the faculty and the student. For student, I feel like you need to be an independent learner, pretty much. Like the faculty will give you something, and then you go back, find the resources, find the information, and to most extent, you need to learn by yourself. But I feel here, maybe our students, they are just get too busy sometimes, so I feel like they rely on the instructor a little bit more rather than rely on themselves. So I don't know, I guess, like what I said earlier, the context is different. So I know for our students, their resources, what I mean is their time resources is very limited. So they spend their energy in their work, in their family. So it kind of makes sense sometimes to me. I feel like as an instructor, I not only need to give them hand, or sometimes I need to provide more information, and motivate them more in order for them to feel more excited or interested in learning process.
So you need to inspire them.
Yes,
Sure
I
you
feel
do.
like
Yeah.
I feel like. So sometimes, it's not when I prepare my teaching material, uh, I not only prepare the content, I need to think about how I deliver the content, how I can make it more fun, more interesting, in a way. Yeah.
Are you writing any books?
Not book at this point. I'm mainly writing a manuscript for publication. Yeah.
What is the manuscript on?
Well, the one manuscript I'm working on is that I'm working with to another international student about the Cuban immigrant adolescents, how they'll perceive discrimination linked to their feeling of depression, and that further can impact on their education attainment. Um, but also we examine how their family cohesion can possibly moderate or buffer that negative impact of discrimination. That's one manuscript we are writing on right now. And so one of the students also doing more in-depth literature review about what research that has been done with the Cuban immigrant family. Yes.
Well, there's the History Miami Museum,
Mm-hmm.
where they took some of, I had a piece of the wall of the old Fifth Street gym from Miami Beach. That was where Muhammad Ali trained and everything. And it has since been demolished. But in the History of Miami Museum, they had a lot of the Cuban history, which I was ignorant of till I went down there, really. Going back to the Peter Pan, and all the different stages of migration they've had. And there's all different generations. And they disagree with one another. For instance, the youngest Cuban American generation will disagree with the grandfather.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, they create another complex,
But they do have generally speaking, of course, very strong family ties, multi-generational,
Yeah.
which is very, very helpful.
Yeah.
And we see the opposite in some of our underserved areas here in the United States. For instance, at the Reitman Boys and Girls Club on Broward Boulevard, which is in zip code 33311, which is one of the worst zip codes in the world. The young people there, mainly African American, they in this poor neighborhood, they don't really have family. They don't. If you ask them to raise their hand if they have two parents, only nobody raises their hand. If you have one parent, only about half of them do. Their foster homes are being brought up by grandparents and things like that. Whereas in many of the Hispanic uh, family trees, which are very diverse themselves, it's very different, as you know, between a Cuban family, say, and a Dominican family and a Venezuelan family. There can be big differences. But they do have the family support that many other ethnic groups do not.
Yeah.
And that's extremely helpful. Yeah. And that goes back to when Ellis Island, when the immigrants first came over to New York, they had, everybody lived in, one building. You had aunts, uncles, cousins, and everything, and now it's different.
Yeah, I mean, while we are analyzing the data, we do find the family cohesion is a significant protector for those kids, to buffer that negative impact of discrimination on their education attainment. We do find that. So the data also prove our theory about that. Yeah, family cohesion is really a very unique cultural characteristic associated with the Cuban family, associated with the Hispanic family. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned like the whole family, they live in the same building. It's still practiced in Taiwan too. Yeah, like I have some female friend, when they got married, they moved into the husband's family of origin. And here's how they situate the family building, okay? So the first floor is the living room and the kitchen on the back. The second floor is for the parents, the grandparents. The third floor is for her and for her husband and for their one kid. And then the fourth floor is for her husband's brother and his wife. Yeah, so they all live together. They all need to learn how to communicate or juggle with each other. For example, who's gonna cook? For lunch, for dinner, who is responsible for which days? That kind of stuff. Yeah.
The families of someone with autism in Taiwan versus the families of someone with autism in America, how do families differ in their approach and what their patterns? Or are they the same?
I feel like what I see is like for those Taiwanese parents, at least for those parents that I luckily have interaction with, I feel like they all work really, really hard. Because when they just notice, or when they have their kids get that first diagnosis, well, first they might feel surprised, what really happened to my kids. But throughout that making sense of process, they gradually accept that kind of label. But then I feel like they don't just give up there. They start to figure out what are those outside resources, their kids can have in order the kids can be more independent functioning in the school or in their daily life. And during that group therapy process, I noticed each parent, they are so willing to share what kind of strategy they have used. This is the successful strategy I noticed. I can help out my kids to do this and that. You might want to try that out. So I don't know. I imagine the parents here is doing pretty much the same thing like your book. I mean, you write those books because you want to provide those practical guidelines for those parents or for even educators or for us to understand how we can really approach those kids. Yeah, so in that sense, I don't feel like they are that different.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Same thing in the world goes round. Do you feel that does Nova Southeastern have a lot of resources for these families and for the autistic individuals?
I mean, at BTI, we do provide the family therapy clinic. We do provide family therapy, for those family too.
How can our Different Brains audience learn more about you?
Me, myself?
Yes. Well, they've just seen you here, and they're very smart. You've got a lot of good stuff. You're helping a lot of people. How do they contact you? Where do they read more about you?
Well, I think they can go to our NSU College of Art, Humanity, and Social Science website. We have a faculty profile. I think they can read more about who I am and in terms of my research interests, in terms of my life experience there. Yes, and there is an email contact. If they are willing to get to know me more, they can click that email address and email me, and then we will continue that conversation.
Are there any topics we have not covered today that you would like to cover?
Well, I wish I can share with you more about my future research study. Maybe after we finish implement that research in Western, and maybe after my analysis or preliminary analysis, maybe I can send you because I think after we got the preliminary analysis, we're gonna find a chance to present those research findings at different conferences. So maybe at that time I can send you here's our research finding, here's my observation, and then we can I can. Maybe I have more insight, in regards to some of your question. What's the difference between Taiwanese family and American family in terms of how they're raising their special kid?
Well, we'll be delighted to have you back if we're lucky enough if you come back to see us.
Okay.
After that,
I would love to.
more information.
Okay.
Great.
Sounds good.
Well, Dr. Pei-Fen Li, it's been such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming in here today and being on this episode of Exploring Different Brains. We learned so much, so thank you very, very much, and we hope to have you back soon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for inviting me and to have further dialogue with you. I really appreciate you giving me this chance, and I hope to talk with you more in regard to my research finding in the future.
Exploring Different Brains is a production of Different Brains, Inc. For more information, visit us at differentbrains.org.